Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jordan and today I am so excited to be talking to you about a truly magical book. In fact, I think this may be the most perfect book that I have ever read. I feel really weird saying that, but honestly, I cannot think of a single criticism that I have for this book. I do feel that it's important to note that I do have a bit of a history with this book. It was my favorite book as a child and one that really got me into reading. So perhaps my views have been clouded a bit by nostalgia, though I don't think that I've been influenced in my reread of this book. We're going to be doing this review in the usual fashion, which is a short non-spoiler section to start this off and just give you my overall thoughts, and then we're going to dive into a spoiler section where I get into the nitty-gritty of why I love this book so much. But with that out of the way, let's just dive right in. So this is a fantasy retelling of a German fairy tale which was popularized by the Grimm brothers by the same name. Princess Annidori Caladra Taliana Isili is the crowned princess of a kingdom called Kildenry. She spends the first years of her childhood with her aunt, who tells her stories of people who can speak to animals, as well as long ago people who could speak to the elements, a language which has been forgotten. Her aunt teaches her how to speak with birds and swans specifically, which Annie finds much easier than conversing with her peers. But when her mother, the queen, catches wind of this nonsense that her sister is teaching Annie, she puts an end to it and sends her sister away. Annie tries hard to learn the skills that she will one day require to be the queen of Kildenry, but she has a very difficult time doing it. And when she turns 16, her mother tells her that she will no longer be the crowned princess of Kildenry, and instead she is set to be married to the Prince of Bayern, a neighboring kingdom. And she even lets on that a lot of this is to do with Annie's inadequacies and her oddities. And of course, on the way to Bayern, things go terribly awry and a lot of adventure and drama ensues. Okay, so this book is like perfection. Like, it just touched my soul and warmed my heart and made my insides turn to jelly. When I was reading this, which by the way, I read it in like 2 days, which is basically unheard of for me. But while I was reading it, I literally could not think of anything else. I was annoying all of my family members, telling them about the amazing story and writing and characters that were captured in these pages. The plot is simple and easy to grasp at any age, but it has some really great twists and turns, especially if you aren't familiar with the original fairy tale. The story also has a universality to it that kind of reminds me of a Pixar film, in that when you read it as a child, you'll pull from it different things than when you read it as an adult. The pace of the novel isn't as fast as you might expect for a fantasy novel, and instead it kind of reminds me of a Studio Ghibli film, where between the intense action sequences, there is time to catch your breath and for the character to contemplate her situation. It never really lags though, and the quiet moments to me are just as captivating as the intense action pieces. The characters are somehow so simple and yet so vivid and whole, and there's just an honesty to their character that while you're reading it, it's not like they're trying to convince you of their character, they just exist and are their character, which is truly remarkable. Annie's character especially is just handled with such care, and her growth in the novel is so natural and gradual that you almost don't notice it happening until you're confronted with it in the end. The writing in this novel is absolutely beautiful. There's an elegance to it, and the writing itself is very romantic. I would most definitely recommend this novel, especially to those that are looking for a very natural, universal story that delves both into the darkness of the world and into the hope and light. Alright guys, with that out of the way, let's dive into the spoiler section of this review. If you haven't read this book, I would highly recommend picking it up, obviously, and turn off this video, go read it. You can thank me later and perhaps even come back to this video to bask in the wonder of this story in the spoiler section and discussion. So if you haven't read this book and want to, thank you for tuning in, and if you have, let's get into this. So let's start out with the plot structure and pacing. So basically, once Annie is on her way to Bayern, which is the kingdom that her betrothed is from, she starts to get a weird vibe from her guards and from her lady-in-waiting Celia, who she's traveling with. And as I mentioned earlier, in this novel, there are people who can speak to animals, people who can speak to the elements, and then there are those like her mother and Celia who are people speakers. And these are basically people who can easily manipulate others, as well as naturally lead those around them. Celia desires the crown, and before they arrive in Bayern, she's convinced about half of Annie's guard to overthrow the other half, which forces Annie to flee into the forest while Celia takes her place. After making some friends in the woods, Annie is able to travel to the city and get an audience with the king. But she realizes once she's in the castle that Celia is already there and she has no evidence to prove her identity. So instead, Annie is forced to take up work and serves as the king's Goose Girl. She befriends the other workers who are in charge of the king's animals, and she falls in love with a king's guard named Garrick. And finally, on the weekend of the royal wedding, she confronts the king with her new friends and witnesses, where she discovers that Garrick is in fact not a king's guard, but the prince himself, who she was set to marry. He is ultimately the one who finds a way to persuade the king into believing that Annie is in fact who she says she is. As I mentioned earlier, it's very strange to me, but the pacing of this is so reminiscent of a Studio Ghibli film. There is an interview with Hayao Miyazaki, who is one of the creators of Studio Ghibli and the director of many of its films. And basically he explains the concept of ma, which is an untranslatable Japanese word that basically represents space or stillness or emptiness between beats of action in a story. He likens it to clapping, where the space between each clap gives power to the clap itself. And I feel as though, intentionally or unintentionally, Shannon Hale has kind of followed the same philosophy in her creating of the story. Despite it being in third person limited, we are intimately aware of what's going on in Annie's head as she plots and contemplates and lives and grows. It's spectacular to witness because it's oftentimes so simple and real. As I mentioned earlier, the plot is fairly simple, though there are some really great twists and turns, but there's also a darkness to the story. There is death and betrayal, and it's not afraid to be really sad at times. When I read this book, it was marketed towards children and middle grade readers, but when I picked it up the other day to reread it, it is now in the young adult section. And I think again that speaks to the universality of the story because I think it comfortably fits in both. So let's move on to the world and setting. The world in this novel is very much European fantasy based, with kingdoms and castles and monarchy. There aren't any magical beasts or races. The fantasy elements are definitely very understated. It's not a very fantasy heavy fantasy novel, so if that's what you're looking for, this probably won't do it for you. Instead, the elements are really simple and clear, and they're established in the first 1 or 2 chapters. The fantasy elements are integrated through the story consistently, but it never takes the forefront, and I think instead it takes a step back to fully allow the plot and characters to lead the story and is enriched by the whimsicality of the romantic writing. So speaking of the writing in this novel, it is absolutely beautiful. I have no idea how Shannon Hale was able to write something that's so poetic and romantic that is also really engaging for young readers. And it's also very descriptive of nature. Even when describing things that are not nature, the author oftentimes compares it to natural elements, and it really serves to enrich Annie's character as someone who feels more comfortable in the company of trees rather than amongst her peers. This is the level of thoughtfulness and intention that is put into the writing, and I think it really shows in the final product of the book. I'm now going to read a few passages that I pulled from the book so that you get an understanding of what Shannon Hale's writing style is like. Annie opened her curtains and breathed in the warm night air. Cricket voices battled for more night, and she wished she could grant it to them. Her brown travel dress with wide skirts hung over a chair. When the sun rose, she would go. From her window she could not see the direction they would travel, so she sat facing north and contemplated the familiar view. No more crying, she told herself. It was not difficult. Her eyes were dry and sore. She concentrated on forming the images and sensations of her Kildenrian life into a body, and in her mind burying that body peacefully, next to her father's tomb in the soft summer earth. So that's what I mean when I say that it spends a lot of time in contemplation. But it can also have an intensity to it, as we will see with the next one. He took a step forward. You like being a princess? I don't know. It is what I am. Do you like being a man? He walked to her, dead pine needles breaking like glass under his boots, and crouched beside her. He leaned in. Her pulse snapped in her throat. "Do you like that I am a man?" he smiled. His teeth looked rotted at the roots. So again, you can feel the intentionality of each word that is used, and it really creates this poignant and vivid sensation while you're reading the book. This is one that I really love because I think it is so effective. In only a couple sentences, you really understand the feeling of being there. The corpses emanated death under the fierce gaze of the sun. It was the biting odor of sour meat and fresh blood, and it touched the back of her throat like a finger. It touched the back of her throat like a finger. I can feel that. I think the writing really lends itself and embraces the fact that it is a retelling of a fairy tale. Okay guys, so as always we've gotten to the favorite part of every review that I do, which is as always the characters. And I am so excited to talk about the amazing cast of characters in this novel. So let's start with the workers that Annie befriends. This is where we spend the majority of the book, is with Annie being a goose girl. And while a lot of the characters aren't super developed per se, they are very distinct. We have a clear understanding of who each of them are. For example, Razzo wants desperately to be a man and a warrior, and he therefore has this strong bravado that he puts on to overcompensate. I would say Conrad is one of the more developed workers. He is the goose boy, and basically at the start of the novel, he is a very effective goose boy. He is proud of the work that he does. And then Annie comes along and she's able to learn the language of the geese and is much better at being the goose girl than he ever was at being the goose boy. Not only that, but Annie also befriends the other workers and he feels very jealous and insecure. And because he's young and immature, he doesn't know how to handle these feelings and acts out. Annie was almost killed because of his actions, which was obviously never his intent. And because of that, he really recognizes his immaturity and learns and grows from it, becoming one of Annie's fiercest and most loyal protectors. Enna is one of my favorite characters in this novel. She is charming and charismatic and headstrong, and she's constantly messing with the other workers in the novel by pranking them and teasing them ceaselessly, but you can tell that she would literally lay down her life for any one of them. She is so strong. Her friendship with Annie is one of the highlights of the book for me. This is one of the clearest examples in my memory of what a female friendship can be in literature. There are so many portrayals of women being awful to women in books, and it's so refreshing to see a friendship that is so pure and strong. It's very reminiscent to me of the friendship between Anne and Diana in Anne of Green Gables. It's this friendship that teaches Annie to trust again after all the betrayal that she's dealt with. It also gives a confidence to Annie that she'd never yet had. Enna pushes her, but in a way that feels safe and allows her to really grow. Next up, I'd like to talk about the prince. Now, Garrick is by no means the most developed character in this story, but his relationship and romance with Annie is one of the sweetest and healthiest I've ever seen. This too reminds me of Anne and Gilbert in some ways, but I would say that Annie and Garrick's relationship and courtship is a lot less turbulent than that of Anne and Gilbert's. So again, I'm going to read a passage from the book so that you get a sense of that courtship. So after Garrick unsuccessfully tries to bring her flowers, this is what happens. "Garrick," she called. He turned back around. "What kind of flowers were they?" "I don't rightly know," he said. He made faltering gestures with his hands, forming their size and shape from the air. "They were yellow and smallish and had lots of petals." "Thank you," she said. "They were beautiful." I would say that his character, kind of like Enna's, serves to really push Annie to become the person that she is at the end of the book. There are so many other great and distinct characters in this novel, like Finn and his mother, who are the people who discover Annie in the forest, Annie's aunt, Annie's mother, her horse Falada, and of course her loyal guard Talone. But for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to move on to the kind of main cast of characters that are really important to the story. So next up, I think we really need to talk about Celia and Unglad. They are the antagonists of this novel, and they are absolutely terrifying. To me, antagonists that are capable of manipulating others are some of the most scary, and Celia fits that to a T. Ungalad is her lover and is a mercenary who is basically unparalleled in his physical prowess in this novel. He is the one that is mostly responsible for the coup before Annie's arrival in Bayern. They are also scary not only for their strengths, but because they are unafraid to use those strengths. It becomes apparent very quickly that they are willing to kill and do anything in their power to achieve their goals. And because of that, the stakes are so high and so clear, and there is a tension that just permeates the novel. I would say that they are one of the primary reasons that this novel is so powerful, especially because when Annie confronts them at the end, it is a show of great strength and bravery, something that she would have never been able to do at the start of the story. So speaking of Annie, it's time to finally talk about our main character, and I absolutely adore her. It is very rare in a novel that I like the main character more than any of the side characters, but somehow Shannon Hale has managed it in this story. I'm gonna be honest, I've read a lot of books recently where I've been very underwhelmed by the protagonists in the story, and this is even from books that I really enjoyed. I just find that in a lot of stories the protagonists are not clearly defined or very consistent in their actions, and I think that a lot of that has to do with not wanting to alienate the audience. But somehow Annie is very clearly defined, she has very strong personality traits, and yet she never alienated me once. She somehow progresses from this shy girl who has no confidence in herself, someone who wants to run away and hide amongst her friends in the forest, to a strong leader who is willing to put her life on the line for the people of Kildenry. And this all happens so gradually that we scarcely realize that it's happening. I honestly think the elegance with which this character is handled is unparalleled in YA and middle grade stories alike. I have never read anyone like Annie. She is a very insecure person at the start of this novel. She's very insecure about her social skills. Both her mother and Celia, her lady-in-waiting, the people who surround her, are people speakers and easily able to manipulate, which makes her both feel inadequate and dumb. And if we're being honest, she's not that great socially. She has a long way to go before she's ready to rule anyone. This influences her throughout the novel and really manifests itself in her actions. These are flaws that are real and grounded and that make sense in the story. But then she is thrust from her comfort zone. She's forced to grow up from the losses and the betrayal that she experiences, and from that she's able to rebuild herself into a more powerful, more charismatic, stronger person than she had ever imagined she could be. And tell me that is not beautiful. But that is all I have for you guys today. If you have read this book, then I would love to hear your thoughts about it in the comment section down below. And if you haven't read it, then I sincerely hope that I've convinced even one of you to pick up this spectacular work. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!